Good evening and welcome to the Week in Review. I'm Paris Schutz. We'll be joined by our Week in Review guests in just a moment, but first, some of today's top stories. Illinois public health officials confirmed that a COVID variant first identified in the UK has made its way into the state. That variant is believed to be more transmissible than other strains of COVID-19, but it can also be diagnosed with tests already in use, and there is no evidence it causes a more severe illness at this point, according to the CDC. Today, Illinois Public Health Director Dr. Ngozi Ezike sought to reassure the public that the existing COVID vaccine would successfully treat this new variant. We'll have more on this in just a bit. Some parts of the state are moving toward looser restrictions on bars and restaurants, but not Chicago or Cook County. Regions 1, 2, and 5, which include areas around Rockford, north central Illinois, and southern Illinois, will move to Tier 2 mitigations because of declining COVID numbers. Those mitigations include opening museums, casinos, and recreational facilities at 25% capacity. But indoor dining and drinking still remain suspended. However, Governor J.B. Pritzker gave restaurant and bar owners a glimmer of hope Friday by announcing if regions reach Tier 1 restrictions, then indoor dining and drinking would be allowed at 25% capacity or 25 people. Meanwhile, state public health officials announced 6,600 new cases of COVID-19, including 123 additional deaths. That makes for a statewide total of 1,059,000 cases and 18,049 deaths. The 7-day test positivity rate is 7.7%. And Governor Pritzker says he's sending National Guard troops to cover Illinois State Capitol and to Washington, D.C. in advance of next week's Biden inaugural. This in the wake of warnings for future terrorist activity from far-right extremist groups.
But we will be adequately protected. And I want to thank the Guard, and I want to thank all law enforcement that are engaged in providing security over the next number of days.
Joining us now are Chuck Gowdy of ABC 7 News, Laura Washington of the Chicago Sun-Times and ABC 7 News, Kristen McQuarrie of the Chicago Tribune, and Nader Issa of the Chicago Sun-Times. Welcome to all of you. Let's get right into it. Kristen McQuarrie, no restaurants or bars doing indoor dining in Chicago or Cook County quite yet. When do you think there might be light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, I think we're at a positivity rate of around 10%, and the governor wants us to get down to, I think it's 6.5% over 3 days. But we just posted in an editorial that he needs to do more. You can still go shopping. You can walk into a Home Depot. You can board a flight with 300 passengers and breathe alongside them for long flights across the country. And so to not trust restaurants that they can socially distance and enforce masks is unreasonable at this point.
Although, Laura Washington, if restaurants do reopen at 25% capacity, does that really help them out?
Well, Sam Toyer, the head of the Illinois Restaurant Association, says it doesn't. It just doesn't make it cost effective. And frankly, there's less pressure, I think, at least in terms of keeping people employed and keeping their staffs whole because of some of the stimulus support and the unemployment extensions that came through at the end of last year. So employees want to work and they need to work, but there is a sort of a safety net out there for them. And the other thing is it's the restaurants, in terms of trusting restaurants, there's a lot of restaurants that are open right now that are and operating, and many of them pretty, blatantly. And so I guess that raises the question, if they're not willing to follow the rules now, will they follow the rules when they're given the opportunity to reopen and to do it safely?
And I think one of those restaurants was Gibson over there on the Gold Coast. Let's hear what Illinois Department of Public Health Director Dr. Ngozi Ezike said about the more contagious UK strain of COVID-19 that's now being reported here.
We do not continue to wear our masks, watch our distance, and avoid gatherings. This new variant could sweep across the state as it swept across the UK. And that would lead us back to a place that we don't want to go.
Nader Issa, as this is happening, Biden last night proposed a $2 trillion COVID stimulus and relief bill, which would include $350 billion for state and local governments. What would that mean for Illinois and Chicago, who are drowning in red ink?
Well, before the pandemic, Illinois and Chicago did not have very much money. That's easy to say. And there's been so many expenses with testing and PPE and everything that has gone along with this pandemic. It means a lot. I still think that there's going to be a need for future support from the federal government. I don't think that Illinois and Chicago are quite set with what Biden is proposing. but there's going to the federal government is going to need to step up further if the state and the city are going to be able to make this through the next year or 2 years and all of the fallout that we're going to see.
All right, let's move on to the really fraught situation in Washington, D.C. right now and all across the country. Tensions are so high after these riots and with some of the president's behavior. Chuck Gowdy, what are the security concerns that Chicagoans and that all Americans need to be looking out for over the next week?
Well, as has been put out there for the last few days, the FBI believes that all 50 states are vulnerable, at least the state capitals, to some type of armed insurrection or at least armed protesters showing up there. The state capitol in Springfield boarded up today. The National Guard will be on patrol there over the weekend. There's supposed to be a sizable rally there that the police are concerned about on Sunday. And so, and Illinois is certainly not the worst of all of them. I mean, the contested states in the presidential election have many more concerns here, and protesters and violent militia groups have targeted them over the next few days.
Right, the Attorney General in Michigan has said
guns.
the state capitol there is not safe, she believes.
Well, the state capitol in Michigan hasn't been safe for quite some time because they let people in there with guns, and they've only recently tried to address that problem after there was a kidnapping plot against the governor of Michigan. So Michigan is a problem. The state house in Wisconsin and Madison is also a serious problem, but it could be anywhere. I mean, that is the real problem for law enforcement, is that they just don't know what's going to happen over the next 5 days, especially on Inauguration Wednesday.
At the same time, Kristen McQuarrie, no one really knows what the president's going to do over the next 5 days. Most of his staffers have left. There was a report today that the CEO of MyPillow had walked in with a sheet about how to declare martial law, or some kind of appearing to talk about trying to hold on to power. What do you expect in the next 5 to 7 days?
I mean, it's so unpredictable. It's so hard to say. And that's why I think there was a push immediately following January 6th, the siege on the Capitol, to get Trump out of office right away. We called on the vice president to apply the 25th Amendment. We support impeachment. It doesn't look like there's going to be a trial, but you can't count anything out at this point. I mean, that day put the entire American public and Americans overseas at risk and destabilize the country. So I wish I had a good answer. I read that he's very frustrated that he has lost this platform where he was able to communicate directly with his base.
And Laura, Washington, a lot of Illinois congressional members and across the country say their lives are being put at risk. They're worried about some of their more far-right colleagues who are going past metal detectors in the House, appearing to pack heat in their bags or purses. Is there any evidence that there's been some kind of coordination with some of these members and some of these far-right groups, as Congress people are alleging?
Well, there's been news reports that reflect that, but I don't think there's been any real hard evidence yet. But I think that their fears are reflected in that impeachment vote that happened this week. I think that members of Congress, in addition to feeling very personally threatened, not only now, but during the siege, are taking what Donald Trump did very, very personally, and they're very personally involved in making sure they send a message that this will not stand. And I think they're hoping that the National Guard and all the other efforts that are being made will also reinforce that message with his supporters. One of the things that I'm looking for him to do, for the president to do before he leaves, is to issue some pardons. The one thing you can count on Donald Trump doing is taking care of his own interests. And I think he's going to, and this has been reported, that he's looking at doing some pardons, particularly for close personal friends and allies like his personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, and perhaps even some of his family members. And he's also asked some of the lawyers in his orbit to look at the idea of him pardoning himself. There's a lot of questions, and legal experts don't agree on whether or not that's even feasible or legal. But I think you're going to see some interesting pardons coming out of the White House before Wednesday.
Chuck Gowdy, you've covered a lot of federal investigations. Have you ever covered something with this kind of scope where you have the Deputy Attorney General of Washington or Second Assistant or whatever the title is, because we're not hearing from the FBI head or the head of the Department of Justice or the acting head. It's a lot to keep track of. Have you ever seen an investigation of this kind of scope?
I don't think anybody's seen a situation like this, period. And the fact is that there were investigative reports in the days leading up to the Capitol attack that would indicate there was some type of problem brewing. And this was not an intelligence failure. It was a failure to act on intelligence. And I think that's the direction that the investigation has to go. It's a little bit cliche to say, you know, who knew what and when, but those are the kinds of questions that the authorities are going to have to figure out now. To the extent that there will be any conclusions reached at the end of this. I mean, who's running the investigation? There will be many of them over the next months to try to figure out exactly what happened.
And it has ensnared some Chicago area folks. Chuck, is there anything that stands out about some of the folks that have been arrested that are from this area?
Well, the few things that stand out are that they would seem to fall into the group that have been swept up in fairly minor charges initially. I mean, the FBI has said that their routine in cases like this is that they want to get people into the system. So they arrest them, charge them with misdemeanors in the case of the Northwest Side Jefferson Park man who was arrested. And then they go to a grand jury and conceivably up the charges to felonies and much more serious encounters with the government.
Nader East, as we talk, Illinois is sending National Guard troops to Washington. There could be as many as 25,000 total. Folks there describe it as a green zone in a war-torn country. What's your reflection just on the state of affairs that we're at right now?
Well, yeah, you look at photos of National Guardsmen in D.C. They're quartering in the Capitol for the first time since the Civil War. The city looks like a war zone. All the streets are blocked off. Capitol grounds are going to be off limits. It's just surreal to see that many members of the military in D.C. for what should be and historically has been a peaceful transfer of power in the United States. So it's jarring to see. And I read a news story a couple of days ago that the number of troops expected to be in D.C. over the next week is more than the U.S. has in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia combined. So that puts it into a little bit of perspective for you.
Certainly.
It's actually 10 times more troops than we currently have in Iraq.
It's a shocking number to get your head around. Krista McQuarrie, back home, the FOP head, John Catanzara, made some controversial statements saying that he understood why the rioters did what they did, and then he walked them back. Do you think that his tenure is in jeopardy now as the head of the police union?
I mean, it's up to the members, but they certainly knew when they elected him they were getting a very radical voice for their issues. I think it's put police and law enforcement and conservatives into a pretty tight box that they try to justify in any way this attack that ended in the death of a Capitol police officer. I mean, there's no justifying it. He did try to walk his comments back, but the members need to rise up if they find him to be an inappropriate person representing them.
We'll have to follow that. And after being impeached for the second time, the president spoke via the official White House Twitter account. This after he was suspended permanently from that social media platform. And in his 5-minute scripted speech, he did not mention the impeachment. Take a look.
Mob violence goes against everything I believe in and everything our movement stands for. No true supporter of mine could ever endorse political violence.
Laura Washington also doesn't mention that Joe Biden is the legitimate winner of the election and will take the oath of office on Wednesday, and this notion of a rigged election was certainly not true. Is this enough to calm tensions down?
Well, this is nothing new. I mean, he's already said that he's not going to attend the inauguration. He's going to leave Washington before the inauguration. He has made it clear that, you know, and this is a pattern with him. He, on the one hand, will say he condemns violence, but then he won't condemn the actors and the folks that committed that violence. So it's a pattern. I think that the impeachment showed that people really aren't buying that his arguments any longer. You know, whether or not the anger and the concern about what he has done and whether or not these acts were illegal or acts of insurrection. I think that will be decided if the Senate decides to move ahead with with a conviction. But if that happens, that won't happen until after he's out of office.
Chuck, what kind of legal exposure do you think the president faces for this or for any number of other things?
Well, there's a difference between legal exposure and some finality to the exposure. That really is going to be the key here. I mean, there'll be some action attempted along the way, whether there are these civil lawsuits in a number of states or criminal investigations that still exist in New York State alone that really open him up to some serious problems. It's not just what's happening in the Congress right now for him and being unemployed. He has some hefty legal bills that he's going to have to pay along the way.
And as we went on the air tonight, news broke that the prosecutors in Georgia are considering a criminal investigation into the president's alleged attempts to influence the election there. Let's move on to another historic moment that happened on the same day the president was impeached for the second time. The longest-serving speaker in the Illinois House, and in fact in the nation, Michael Madigan, handed the gavel to one of his top lieutenants. Here's what new Speaker Chris Welch had to say.
I have learned a lot from his leadership. There are some things that I would like to continue, but there are some things that I would do differently.
Kristen McQuarrie, what are the machinations that brought Chris Welch to this point, to take over for the longest-serving speaker in U.S. history?
It really started with the collection of those 19 House Democrats who began to speak out and say they wouldn't support him for speaker. If not for that group, you should all remember them at election time. They stuck their necks out. We might still have a Speaker Madigan, but once he could not get to the 60 votes he needed, that started with that group. There were, caucus meetings back and forth to see who could build the most support, and it ended up being Chris Welch, who, for people who follow Springfield politics, I don't think was a huge surprise. He's part of Madigan's leadership team. He serves as a parliamentarian in the House at times when the Speaker is not in that role. He's one of Madigan's lieutenants. He's the first Black House Speaker, so he had the support of two of the minority caucuses.
And let's not forget, he chaired that committee into investigating ComEd and Madigan's role, which pretty much yielded nothing. So, Laura Washington, knowing all that, is this really a sea change, or is Madigan still going to have some sway behind the scenes here?
Well, I wouldn't call it a sea change. Maybe it's a lake change, because there will be changes. I believe Chris Welch when he says he's going to be his own man, but he is a very close ally of Mike Madigan. He stuck up for Mike Madigan during that special investigative committee that he ran on ComEd, and Chris Welch himself has said he's going to be consulting with Madigan. Why would he? Madigan brings 40 years of deep experience in running a legislature, but he also does have the support of as Christian points out, the support of a broad coalition of members. He got far more votes than he needed to get. He got way past 60, I think, to 69 votes, and it started beyond the 19 that she mentions. It started also with the Black Caucus, because he was able to bring the Black Caucus together around him. I believe that there was conversation between the Black Caucus and Mike Madigan about Madigan saying to them, if not me, then one of you. And because Welch also had good relationships not only across the aisle with Republicans, but more importantly with the members of the Latino caucus, he was able to build the numbers he needed to get to victory.
Chuck, you've covered this state a long time. It's hard for me to picture Madigan doing anything that isn't some kind of 3D chess move. Do you really think that Madigan truly is done as the power broker in Illinois?
Well, he may not only be done there, but I mean, he may also be done with politics. For somebody who has been at the top of the trash heap in Springfield for so long, to now be at the bottom of it or someplace in the middle, I'm not sure that really is Mike Madigan's style. So we shouldn't stop watching him, because it'll be interesting to see what he does politically. And of course, he is far from out of the legal woods. The ComEd investigation clearly is working toward him, and the fact that he has not cooperated with the authorities, he's not cut a deal to step down with them, would certainly lead you to believe that he still faces a lot of exposure here.
Certainly he has been implicated in that investigation. Nader Issa, while that was happening, Springfield did get a lot of other stuff done. What was some of that stuff?
One of the major pieces of legislation that they passed is this criminal justice reform bill that has a lot of big pieces in it. One of them, the end to cash bail in Illinois. If Governor Pritzker signs it, there will no longer be cash bail. Defendants will either be released, or if they're deemed a safety threat to the community, they'll be held with no bail. That's one piece of the criminal justice reform bill. There are also implications for police unions. There was a lot that was passed. There were a couple pieces that relate to education. So I think my takeaway from all of the pieces of legislation that were passed this week, not every single one, but a lot of them put Mayor Lori Lightfoot in a tough spot. There was a firefighter's pension bill that was passed that is going to make her job tough financially. There was a bill that strengthens the Chicago Teachers Union's bargaining rights. All of those are going to make for an interesting time ahead in Chicago.
Certainly that CTU bill was a bill they wanted and something the mayor wasn't so keen on. And let's switch over to schools news. The battle between the Chicago Teachers Union and the Chicago public school system over the return to in-class learning. Take a look at what CPS CEO Janice Jackson had to say today.
There are things that worked well. There are things that we have to still work on and tweak. But I have even more confidence in our plan after implementing it this week.
So Nader, week one of a return to in-person for cluster, special education, and early learners. How did it go? Do we know whether there are any COVID outbreaks? I think different people have put different numbers out there. What do we know?
As far as outbreaks go, there's one school that has a little bit of an outbreak brewing. CPS is calling it a cluster of cases now. There are 2 confirmed cases among staff members, 8 staff members who are quarantining, including the school's principal and assistant principal. I've heard there is now as little as 1 teacher still in the building. There are a few other cases at different schools, which is to be expected. Even if transmission isn't happening inside of schools, you'd expect the same rate of cases in the community to find its way into people who are working inside the schools. But it was an interesting first week. The CTU definitely is making its voice heard. It's planning a lot of actions. There were a lot of teachers who are required to go to work in person and aren't showing up. And a point of contention late this week has been that those teachers are now being locked out of remote teaching. They're not being paid anymore. And the CTU thinks that they should continue to be paid and allowed to work remotely. And so it's going to be interesting moving forward. There's a lot of split opinions on it. Some parents, some families are happy to be back. We heard Janice Jackson. She's not wavering at all. She wants to keep this reopening plan going, and we'll see. There's about 77,000 more students expected back in a couple weeks.
So clearly the teachers union is not happy about the way CPS has handled it. Kristen, do they have a point that they should be able to negotiate this, or are they just trying to cause more trouble?
Well, so I write opinions, so I get to.
You get to opine. You're an opinion columnist.
There's nothing that CPS could do that would please the Chicago Teachers Union. CPS has put filters in classrooms. They've tried to do what they can to make sure classrooms are safe. You have a model in front of you of the Catholic school system and other private schools who have been open at least partially since the beginning of the year. Yes, some of them have had to temporarily pull groups of kids out when they have a case, but you have a model in front of you that is working. And so the CTU will just continue to obstruct as long as they can, and at the expense of, data has shown, minority and Black students who are not doing well in this remote situation.
Laura, how does this stare down, and it seems like we're always talking about a stare down when we talk about education in Chicago, this game of chicken between CTU and CPS resolve itself?
Well, that remains to be seen. I think that the CTU has proven its mettle in the past. That this is not the first time they've confronted CPS, and they don't hesitate to strike. I think though this whole point about the racial aspect of this is important to remember. Many of the parents who are more eager to get their kids back in school, and I don't have scientific evidence, but from what I'm hearing, it tends to be the white parents, and the parents who are most concerned about the disease tend to be parents of color, and that's not an accident because those communities are being much more impacted by the virus. And the teachers union makes that case. The CPS also makes a case on the other side. By keeping kids out of school, you're hurting communities of color first. So this is I'm unsure how this is all going to play out.
It's a very difficult situation to resolve, but we are out of time, so we can't resolve it here. My thanks to Krista McQuarrie, Chuck Gowdy, Laura Washington, and Nader Issa. Thanks so much. And that is our show for this Friday night. We're back at 7 o'clock all next week. A WTTW News special, The History of Poverty in the Chicago Area, where it stands today and where to go from here. That's all part of our latest first-hand initiative focusing on poverty. And now for the Week in Review, I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you so much for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm, sponsoring a free continuing legal education program for over a decade for lawyers across the state.